You see, if you and I don't act on a promise, you've got to question whether or not we believe it. And if we don't act on it, we'll miss it. If we don't act on it, it can't be fulfilled. If we don't act on it, it can't be a part of us. Now, that doesn't mean if we don't act on it, God's promise won't continue. It doesn't mean to you if you and I don't act on it, God won't bless somebody else with it. But if we don't act on it, we miss out. If we don't act on it, we're the poorer from letting it go by or not partnering with God in the promise. What was the promise? Well, it goes all the way back to Abraham. Didn't you catch that? That embarrassing moment that it was 14 generations from Abraham to David. Now that's a good period, isn't it? Abraham, the first Jew. David, the greatest king that Israel ever knew. But between Abraham and between David, there's a lot of pain. And there are quite a few moments of the dark night of the soul, are there not? Think about even in Abraham's grandchildren, Jacob and Esau, warring with each other. Thanks be to God, 20 years later, there's some reconciliation. But then Joseph, the son of Jacob, spares the Hebrews and spares all of Egypt from starvation. But the Bible says it. It says that after Joseph, the people of Egypt forgot Joseph. And because the Hebrew people grew to such massive number, the Egyptian leaders were threatened. And they said, we've got to enslave these people. If we don't, they may take us over. And so the minority was increasing in such population that the Egyptian leaders felt threatened. And for 400 years, the Hebrew people were in slavery. 400 years. That was a dark night of the soul for the people of Israel. So from Abraham to David, and then from David to the Babylonian exile. That's an embarrassing time. It's an embarrassing time because God's hand was on the people of Israel, the Hebrew people. And when they were obedient and they were faithful, they put God first in their lives. When they put God first in their worship, I'm not talking about just ritualistic kind of worship. I mean heartfelt prayers, devoted nature to care for the poor, reach out to the marginalized, care for the widow, care for the orphan. When they fulfilled what God asked them to do, God blessed them. But when they decided to live life for themselves and they started to worship other gods and goddesses, when the lust of the flesh got the best of them and they engaged in all kinds of orgies and had all kinds of different polytheistic gods and goddesses to support that lifestyle, God took his hand away. When they began to follow greed and took advantage of the poor, God took his hand off. When they began to worship other idols instead of worshiping the God of Israel, God took his hand off. And eventually foreign governments came in and took them over, and the Babylonians exiled them for 70 years. They were away from the very land that God had brought them into through Joshua. It was shameful. It was painful. But they had to admit, largely, we brought it on ourselves. Now, there are some of us that are going through the winter of the soul right now. You didn't bring something on you. It happened. It's an accident. Something is beyond your control, but you're still in the winter of the soul. No doubt. Some of us had made poor choices and made mistakes, and we might be in the winter of the soul right now. When you find yourself in the winter of the soul, is there a way through? Is there a way out? Is there hope? Matthew's gospel says yes, there is. And that's our plain truth today. If you'll take your outline out and follow along with me, we'll look at that plain truth. Let's share it together. Those of us in Lincolnton and Mountain View and online, let's read the plain truth together. Ready? Here we go. Claiming God's promises produces hope no matter our past or present circumstances. Claiming God's promises produces hope. It allows hope to emerge within us and around us, no matter our present or past circumstances. Sometimes we've gone through some past circumstances that may have been embarrassing for us, and we're still living into some of the consequences of that. We'd rather forget it. We'd rather not repeat that. We'd rather people not know about that part of our lives. It's embarrassing, it's shameful, whatever the case may be. But sometimes the paradox of those painful, shameful moments is that God may actually want to work through that past, work through that circumstance, work through that pain with you, and allow His redemptive resurrection spirit to allow that particular situation to become not only a defining moment for you, but also maybe the very place where you will live out your purpose and calling in life, because God's been there. God's helped you through that darkness. God's walked with you through it. You found hope, and maybe that's your calling, to help others through that addiction, to help others through that painful experience, to help others through that painful reality of giving up a child for abortion, or whatever it is that you've lived with and dealt with and been afraid of or ashamed of in the past. God may use that circumstance, if you'll let Him, to claim His promise of redemption and forgiveness and new life, to redeem it and reshape it, and allow Him to be glorified through it when you've walked through that winter of the soul. Or it may be a present circumstance. It may be a relationship that's marginal. It may be a family situation where the tension is so palatable that you're very concerned about where you're going to spend Christmas or how you're going to be with certain members of the family. It may be that the table of Christmas this year will have one less person there whom you've loved and whom you've cared about. And that's a very painful reality for you, whether it's been a separation or divorce, whether it's been a death of a loved one, whatever the case may be. But claiming God's promises helps us to live into the hope that Christ has for us. It opens that hope. It enables that to break forth within us. But we've got to claim His promises. What do we mean by claiming His promises? That means acting on them. That means believing them to be true and stepping into them. As hard as that may be sometimes. Because when you're going through anxiety or depression, you're walking through a dark time, sometimes it's hard to be resolute. Sometimes it's hard to take that step. But even if it's a baby step, even if it's a small step, but if it's a step of hope, if it's a step of obedience, God will help you as you make those steps.